Well, good afternoon. All right. As we get started, I want to take a moment and thank the Janus Players, the Art Club, and the Radio Club for agreeing to reschedule their event this afternoon, recognizing the importance of this discussion and also their help in volunteering here, enabling this forum to proceed. I also want to mention that during the course of this event, there will be note cards available, and if you feel like writing a question down, passing it to the end of the rows, we'll get those collected. We'll be doing that after our four panelists present. There'll be some time at the end for some Q&A from the audience. On November 1st, the Cape community came together for an interfaith service in response to the senseless violence at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. In my remarks and the collective conversation, we spoke of the need for pushing forward from a foundation of thoughts and prayers to a broader discussion that moves us ahead. And just a week after that interfaith service, we were extolling thoughts and prayers once again for the tragedy in Thousand Oaks, California. The concern, over time, fatigue begins to set in. These events become more and more normal. Mass violence becomes less unexpected. Have we reached a point where we're desensitized by these events? In deciding to move ahead with this dialogue today, attempting to bring the community together before the semester ends, it's about what comes after thoughts and prayers. Further, we recall our college mission and vision as a teaching and learning community. We enrich our unique region as an innovative center for academic excellence and community enrichment that champions student success. We created this opportunity outside of the classroom, a teachable moment not only for our students, but our college and our broader community. The intent today is to provide a broad spectrum of perspectives, starting with a view from Virginia Tech, a major turning point in higher education that changed how colleges approach public safety and mental health, followed by the view of a first responder and a survivor of such an event. Recognizing the mental health aspect at play among the perpetrators, we have a deeper look at what we collectively learned over time and can learn moving ahead. Is there an avenue for augmented intelligence to help society become more proactive in identifying future perpetrators, whether through social media, mental health channels, or public safety organizations? Finally, we reflect on the Bill of Rights and the Second Amendment. We have to acknowledge that the vast majority of gun owners and gun users do so in a safe, law-abiding way. How do we ensure that continues while collectively striving for safer communities? Hopefully today will enhance your thinking about this, perhaps from new perspectives and at a deeper level. Now, let's meet Lisa Hamp. Lisa is a survivor of the Virginia Tech shooting that took place in April of 2007. During the shooting, Lisa and her classmates laid on the floor, pushing the desk and chairs against the door. Fortunately, their barricade held, and the shooter was unable to enter the classroom. Today, Lisa speaks and writes about her experience surviving and recovering from the Virginia Tech shooting to help others. Let's welcome Lisa.
Can you hear me now? Much better. Okay, good. So Virginia Tech's located in Blacksburg, Virginia. It's the southwest corner of Virginia, and it's a very rural and country area, out in the middle of nowhere. So if you find yourself in Blacksburg, Virginia, it's most likely that it has something to do with the university. Virginia Tech had over 30,000 students and faculty at the time, and the town of Blacksburg had 40,000. So it's very much like the town is the university and vice versa. I'm going to point out two buildings here. One of them is this H, that's West AJ, and the other is this L-shaped building, Norris Hall. And I point these two buildings out because on April 16th, 2007, these are the two buildings in which the shootings occurred. There were 2 deaths in West AJ, and then a couple hours later, there were 30 deaths in Norris Hall. So that morning, April 16th in West AJ, between 7:03 and 7:17, the shooter shot 2 people. The first was a young girl named Emily, and then the second was the RA on the floor named Ryan. So what had happened was Emily was headed to her 8 a.m. class, and her boyfriend dropped her off out front of the building. She was headed up to the 4th floor, and she got there, and that's when the shooter shot her. The RA heard the noise, went to investigate, saw Emily, so the shooter shoots Ryan, the RA, and he leaves. And we know that this happens between 7:03 and 7:17 because at that time at Virginia Tech, to get into a building that was not your dormitory, you had to use an access card. And so we know that Emily uses her access card at 7:03 to get into the dorm, and we know that the shooter uses his access card to get into his dorm right across from West AJ at 7:17. So that kind of bookends when this first shooting happens. But when this is all happening, I am asleep in my apartment off campus. So I know nothing about this first shooting. I think it's a regular Monday morning, and I'm headed to my 9:05 class. It was computer science in Norris Hall. And this is a picture of Norris Hall. My class was right here. So it's above the bush to the left of this. This is stairwell windows. These windows right here were also mine. So this is where my computer science class was on the 2nd floor. And this is a layout of the 2nd floor. There were 2 other language classes on my side. Across the hall were 3 classrooms. 2 were engineering in session, and then a 3rd classroom class was canceled that Monday morning. So 5 of the 6 had class in session for the 9:05 block that morning. This is a picture of what a typical classroom looked like. It's not exactly mine. Mine had a chalkboard instead of a whiteboard, but everything else is the same. We had these these windows right here, as well as a door. Door did not have a lock. Door did not have windows, as well as the interior hallway wall did not have windows. And this is a picture of some furniture in my classroom. So this is a podium table. It was hard, it was thick, it was sturdy, but it was stuck to the ground. It was cemented into the ground. The card table was typical card table, light, flimsy, easy to move. And this was the layout of my classroom. There was 10 of us in class that day, and we had a teaching assistant who was subbing for our professor. I am this pink little dot, and the other gray dots represent the other people in my class. So what had happened is about 9:40, we first hear the gunshots. Sounds like, and I remember when I first heard them, it sounds like gunshots. But I don't come from a military family or a hunting family, so that sound is not familiar to me. So in my mind, I'm trying to think, okay, it sounds like gunshots, but gunshots don't belong in schools, so what else could that be logically? What else could that sound be? But my gut is telling me something isn't right. So very quickly when I heard the sound is this disconnect between what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling. But luckily I had students and a teaching assistant in my class who wanted to go investigate the sound. So they went out into the hallway to see what was going on. And just as they did this, the shooter came out of a classroom across the hall. He shoots at them and just misses. They come back into the classroom. And I remember my teaching assistant saying, "Guns. There's a man with guns in the hallway." She didn't just say, vaguely, "Call 911 or hide under your desk." But she was clearly articulating, and it wasn't quite like that. So law enforcement's perspective was we got a phone call. It said a couple shots fired, and they arrived to a scene where 50 people had been shot. So they are now trying to find the threat. And, they don't know, is that threat in our classroom? So they are coming, and they have their guns out in front. So we have to put our hands up, we have to leave everything, and we're escorted out of the building. I never understood why we had to go out the exit farthest from our classroom, because that would have been a lot closer, and I wouldn't have had to walk down this hallway. So I hadn't prepared myself for this walk, because up until this point, everyone in my classroom was physically unharmed. So I didn't know the actions of the other classrooms until I had to walk out to another building and exit this building. I had to hang around for my police interview, and within 24 hours, our campus looked like this. It was overtaken by the media. And then I headed home to Northern Virginia for the summer. And so my summer plan was to hang out at the pool. And that sounds relaxing and great. But the problem is when you're having post-traumatic stress and anxiety and fear and you feel lonely, it's not as great as it was. I started going to counseling. And at the end of every counseling session, my counselor would ask, are there any changes in your sleeping habits? I'd say no. She'd ask, are there any changes in your eating habits? And I remember lying and saying no, because there had started to be changes in my eating habits, but I didn't understand how these were related to the post-traumatic stress, the anxiety, and the nightmares, so I didn't share with her that information. I now know that you have to be honest with your counselor for it to work, but I'm still learning here. So I went back for my senior year at Virginia Tech, and I had anxiety all the time when I was in the classroom. I would pick my seat strategically based on what my different escape plans were, how many exits and entrances were there to the classroom, how big the classroom was. My ears would always be on edge if a book would drop. And I always had my eyes on the door, 24/7. Because I later learned that the shooter paced the hallway, and he was looking, they think, for the classrooms that had the most people. And I missed that suspicious behavior. I never saw anybody in the hallway who looked suspicious. And I thought, next time my classmates who took that action to build the barricade, they may not be there for me, and I need to make sure that I'm safe. So I always had my eyes glued to the door. But I also had anxiety outside the classroom, places like gyms, large auditoriums, churches, movie theaters, anywhere where I felt like I was trapped and really far from the exits. I started running, and I was looking for something to control, because on that day of the shooting, I lost control. I felt like I lost control of my safety and my security. And so I was looking for something to control, and for me, that was the scale. So I'd weigh myself every morning. If it was less than the day before, it was going to be a good day. If it was more than the day before, it was going to be a bad day. And I was deciding my mood for the day before I had even brushed my teeth. But I hid that from everybody. So after the shooting happened, I graduated a year later. I started a career working for the Army, got one master's degree in 2009, got engaged, married. Husband and I, we bought a house. I started a second master's degree. And then it came time that we wanted to start a family. But the problem was I was over-exercising and under-eating, so I didn't have a menstrual cycle. So without a menstrual cycle, I was causing some fertility issues. So my husband and I go to a fertility specialist and do the pre-screening. And after that appointment, for the first time, I decided to listen to this tiny voice inside my head that said, you're causing your own problems. Go see an eating disorder counselor. So I did that, and the first session, she asked me to tell me about yourself. And I say, I'm from Northern Virginia. I went to Virginia Tech. There was a shooting my junior year, and I work in the Pentagon now trying to get pregnant. She's like, you want to back up to the shooting your junior year? I'm like, no, I'm a type A personality, so I said, let me get you focused. Focus is on the menstrual cycle. We don't need to talk about that. But it was just a couple sessions later that she got me to open up about what had happened. And I realized the connection between the eating disorder addiction and the trauma that I had experienced. And that trauma had triggered my eating disorder because I was looking for something to help me cope. And that's what food and exercise was. But then I became addicted to it and obsessed with it. So as she's helping me get better. So I describe counseling as this aha moment. I finally was able to start putting the pieces together and see this bigger picture. And as I'm doing this, the 10-year anniversary is approaching. So I'm talking to another survivor, and she asked me if I'm going to go to Blacksburg for the 10-year anniversary. I'm like, oh, I've just been doing all this work in counseling. This would be really beneficial for me, could help give me some closure what she had saw. And that's really important because that got other people in the classroom starting to think, what do we need to do? Because our door doesn't have a lock, and he's just going to open it and come in. So other classmates started thinking. One of them said, we need to build a barricade. Another classmate went and put his body up against the doors. We figured out what that barricade was going to look like. And what we came up with was a card table and a desk that went up against the door. And we split up into two groups, embraced ourselves, and as we're building this barricade, the shooter's at our door. So he shoots through the door a couple times. The bullets just go over us because we're laying low and out these back doors. back windows. And we were lying low, like I said, and this happens for about 30, 40 seconds. And it becomes this pushing battle between the shooter trying to push his way in and kick his way in, and us inside the classroom trying to push and keep the door closed. He then leaves being outside our classroom door. In our classroom, we talk about what we're going to do next. We thought about jumping out the windows, because then we could get out of the building. We thought about going down this stairwell right here, and we thought we wouldn't even have to worry about injuries from jumping out the stairwell because we're the closest classroom to the stairwell, so we could just get out and exit. But when we looked out the windows, it looked chaotic outside as well, and we decided just to make our barricade stronger. And it's a really good thing we did, because we didn't know this but at the time, hindsight's 2020, but the shooter beforehand had chained all 3 stairwell exits. So if you run down that scenario where we would have undone our barricade and tried to exit, we would have been trapped. We'd have to go back out into the hallway and into our classroom, and those are just priceless seconds that I don't think it would have been as fortunate as it was for our classroom. So we decided to just make the card table flush with the door, the desk flush with the card table, and rearrange our bodies and brace ourselves if the shooter comes back. A couple minutes later, he did, and a very similar thing to before, where he was pushing to get in and we're pushing to keep it closed, but it wasn't as much. It was like half the distance. And I remember thinking, if law enforcement could just get here, you know, this barricade is working, I just don't know how much longer. It's almost like when I catch an Uber, you know, when you're headed somewhere, or a cab. You can follow that Uber and know exactly where they are and how much longer. It's like I wanted an Uber app on the law enforcement so we knew how much longer we were going to have to wait. It was just a couple minutes later that the shooter ended up killing himself right after law enforcement arrived. So here's just a brief overview of the timeline. The shooting began at 9:40. It lasted 11 minutes. The shooter took his own life once law enforcement got to the floor. The reason there's this 5-minute gap between when officers arrive and officers enter the floor is because of those chains. When they got there, the law enforcement couldn't figure out how to get to the 2nd floor. It ends up there was a 4th floor shop entrance, which is how they were able to break through that lock and get in. But it took some quick thinking on their part. So we had 2 students who died in West AJ, and that was earlier in the morning at 7 a.m. The shooter took their life. And then this happens around 9:40. There's 25 students who die, 5 teachers, 25 are physically injured, 17 not physically injured. And this was from the November 2009 report. So 2.5 years later, Virginia Tech still had 5 in the status not verified, which kind of confuses me 2.5 years later why they're still there. But that's how the individuals were binned in that report. So law enforcement had entered, and they knock on our door, and they ask to let them in. And we're not so sure because we can't see them. And the last person that was at our door was trying to shoot at us. So we're not quite sure yet. We give it some time. And a half an hour goes by. Police are back at our door asking us to open up. And in the between there, we had this conversation about what we were going to do. We had gotten to the point where we felt comfortable opening up the door. But we were going to do, Zach was going to do so, and he was just going to peek. And if he saw the shooter, he was going to slam the door shut. And that signaled to the rest of us, we need to push back up against the door. If he opened the door and peeked and saw the law enforcement, he was going to open it up all the way and let them in. And he peeks, and he slams the door shut. We're like, Zach. He's like, it's the police. Well, Zach, remember the plan? You're supposed to open it for the police. But as you'd expect, the law enforcement were coming in an offensive manner. Their guns are out in front. Zach peeks and sees a gun in his front, and his knee-jerk reaction is to slam the door. So it's the police. We open it up. They come in. And I remember thinking at this point, I'm so glad they're finally here. You know, they're going to sweep me off my feet. They're going to give me a big hug. They're going to carry me to safety on the tragedy, as well as connect with other survivors and other Virginia Tech Hokies. And so I reach out to Virginia Tech's Office of Recovery and Support, and they tell me, you know, they're asking me, well, what classroom were you in? And I said, I was in 205, the classroom that built the barricade. And they're like, well, I'm sorry, but these resources for hotel rooms and private events, those are only for the physically uninjured or physically injured survivors. So if you're uninjured, you don't get your hotel room comped, you don't go to the private events, and some other things. And I was like, wow, I can't believe, I had no idea that's where you're drawing the line. That doesn't seem right to me. It seems like we should be included too. So I gave it some time, and I wrote this letter to the president of the university, Dear Virginia Tech. And it was an open letter, and I was explaining, I think you should include the 20 physically uninjured survivors in your private events, including, comping us for travel and things like that. Ultimately, Virginia Tech said no. So then I realized, okay, I'm going to give it some more time, but I'm an adult, and I can do something about this. So I launched a fundraising campaign, and I raised enough money for airfare, hotel, and meals for any physically uninjured survivor that wanted to go to the 10-year anniversary. So this is a picture of me and my classmates who finally got together 10 years later. I hadn't seen Zach, he's the one who opened the door, until this day, 10 years later. And my classmates and I, we got together once on campus that week after the shooting, but we still hadn't come together as a group until 10 years later. And it was a really positive and therapeutic experience for me as well as for them. We got to meet other survivors from other classrooms. Some had jumped out windows, some had been shot, and we were just there to share stories and process and heal. So what I wish I knew then, not going back into the classroom was an option. I just kind of pushed my way through it, and I'm going to get through senior year. But when I was feeling uncomfortable, I could have stepped out. I just didn't, and I wish I would have when I look back. Comparison's the thief of joy. So after the incident happened, I created this hierarchy of pain in my mind. And I put those families that lost loved ones at the top, and then I put physically injured survivors. I put physically uninjured survivors in classrooms he entered, and I put myself, a physically uninjured survivor, at the bottom of this hierarchy of pain. I don't need resources, I don't need recognition, but the truth is I did need mental health resources, and I need validation that something traumatic had happened to me. And so this hierarchy of pain did me no good. So I say comparison, it was the thief of joy in this example. I learned that trauma and addiction are linked. For me, it was for an eating disorder, but it can be depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder. And what happens in the event of emergency or a traumatic event is the brain tries to protect you. It tries to, move everything out and just focus on getting yourself to safety. And so now that you've gotten yourself to safety, there's eventually going to become a time where you need to process it. And that's what I didn't want to do. I didn't want to process it. And so because of that, issues started to develop. I talk about how to think about safety. So before the Virginia Tech shooting, I was a 1. I was unaware. I was naive. I took my safety for granted everywhere I went. The shooting happened, and I flipped to a 5. I became obsessive, hypervigilant. I thought about my safety all the time. Now I'm happy to say I'm a 3. So I'm prepared. I have a plan for the places I am most often, but I'm not on either end of this spectrum because neither end is healthy. And these shootings can happen anywhere at any time. That's what we thought in Blacksburg. We thought we were safe. But the truth is that they can happen anywhere at any time. It's about changing the mindset. It's not moving people from a 1 to a 5 on that scale. It's just moving people, nudging them that, let's have a plan for where you are most often. Is it work? Is it school? Is it church? And here are some potential things to think about when it comes to safety. Locked doors would have been great in our situation. They're so simple, but they can really do amazing things when it comes to an active shooter event because no shooter has ever breached a locked door. They've broken glass, but if they've come to a locked door, they move on. And the reason is because they know from their perspective of doing as much harm and ill will as they can, they are trying to maximize the number of deaths. So spending minutes on this locked door, law enforcement's going to arrive. So they typically move on. And then there's access control. So this gets to the first shooting in West AJ. We have to assume that the shooter got into that first dormitory by tailgating somebody because he didn't have an access card to get in there. So if you have key fobs or access cards, by only you using them, you're keeping that building safer for everybody else. And then there's emergency mass notifications. Virginia Tech gets a lot of criticism for not sending out a mass notification in between the 2 shootings. Because what if they had canceled class? What if that second shooting never happened? That first shooting was a man and a woman who had died, and so they were still gathering the facts because they thought it looked like a domestic dispute or something that was very focused and targeted and nothing big was going to be coming later. So that was their reason, and that makes sense to me at the time. And just like we need to prepare for these events, we also need to plan for recovery because when they happen, so much effort goes into this debate against, gun policy versus mental health reform. And we almost just become stalled because we're stuck in this debate that we can't get out of. But there's things we can do, like I just mentioned, locked doors, access control, mass notifications, as well as afterwards. We need a plan for recovery. What mental health resources do we need? How are we going to get them? Where are they going to come from? And so as a physically uninjured survivor, I'm often told that I'm lucky, and that totally resonates with me. I do feel lucky, but that doesn't mean that my recovery journey is going to be easy. It was far from that. It was difficult. So what I learned on April 16th, 2007 at 9:51, I thought that shooting was over. But what I realized was that was just the beginning of a long recovery. Although that shooting was over, and I'd like to think past, present, future, that's behind me. I don't want to go there. But I had to go there in order to recover. So like I said, I started going to counseling because I didn't have a menstrual cycle. And it was about 3 months after going to my counselor that I got my menstrual cycle back. And I was so excited. I was like, oh my goodness, this counseling stuff works. And it was 5 months after that that I got pregnant. And 9 months after that, I had my daughter, Grace Marie. And I now use my menstrual cycle to tell me if I am treating my body healthy. And I continued to, and so then on May 8th, I had my second daughter, Mackenzie Lynn. And I'll just close with why I do what I do. Why do I come up here and share my story? Because I think there's a lot of lessons learned, a lot of things that we can do to prepare in the case of emergency, as well as afterwards when it comes to recovery. Because one day, these little girls, they're going to go to school. I want them to be safe, and I want them to feel safe. And so that's why what I do. I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion. I just put my contact information up here real quick, and I will turn it back over to John. Thank you.
Lisa, a quick question. On April 17th, 2007, when the sun came up, did the university do anything to reach out to help you from a mental health perspective?
Not that I recall. There was very, Thanks, got it, yep. There wasn't much reaching out to especially the physically uninjured, but also that morning they had to, they were accounting for people. They were trying to figure out who's in the hospital, who's where, how are we gonna tell these families? So I think that the population of physically uninjured survivors just got forgotten about because there were more important things they had to be dealing with, which I get. But I think with time then becomes, we need to circle back with these people and see how they're doing. And unfortunately, that never happened. But I also think that's where I fit into this story, is bringing awareness to that so that if future tragedies are going to happen, that physically uninjured don't go forgotten.
Next, we want to welcome Lisa. You can join me up here. Yeah, we have all these seats available. I'm feeling lonely. Hang on to the mic, please. You probably need it at some point. Okay. Next up, we have Joshua Fernandez. On December 12, 2006, then Officer Josh Fernandez responded to a shooting at the Foxy Lady in New Bedford. Sergeant Fernandez and his partner were the first to arrive on the scene. Upon their arrival, the gunman opened fire, wounding them both. He was awarded the George Hanna Jr. Memorial Award for Bravery from the former Governor Deval Patrick, and also received the Medal of Valor by the Massachusetts Police Association. Josh is currently a sergeant with the New Bedford Police Department. Please welcome Josh.
Nice picture of me up there. So I'm just, as Mr. Cox stated, my name is Josh Fernandez. I'm a police sergeant with the city of New Bedford. At the time, I was a police officer for this incident. Well, let me scroll back a little bit. May of 2002, I graduated from the police academy. I actually stood on this stage for my graduation. But in the police academy, we learned about a word, complacency. And the first time I heard that word, I didn't know what it meant, to be honest with you. And they ingrained it into us, complacency, and I didn't learn. And I didn't learn it in life, and nor did I learn it on the job. I was 22 years old when I started this job, so I had a little bit of chip on my shoulder that I was a young guy and I was untouchable. 6 months prior to this incident, I worked midnight, so I was a little on edge, a little agitated. We received a call for an incident outside one of the drinking establishments, and during the call, it come to find out that there was an individual with a little .38 caliber standing right behind me. I was so aggravated and so, so mad at everyone that I had to be at this call because I was so tired that I didn't even realize that the guy was standing 5 feet behind me with a .38. Chase ensued. Luckily, nothing happened. He was arrested and the firearm was obtained from him. But did I learn? No. A couple of weeks after that, May of 2006, I was working with Officer Steve Wadman, who's this gentleman here. My regular partner was taken out of my car, and we were a two-man vehicle, and Steve was brand new. It was his 6th shift on, so it was sixth day, if you will. And now I'm mad because now I have to work with the rookie, realizing that 4 years ago I was a rookie, but we're stopped at a stoplight, and sure enough, directly across the intersection, we witnessed a murder and the shooting of another individual. We were able to chase down one of the suspects. But during that chase, the suspect raised his gun and pointed it at me, and again, I wasn't ready. Just complacency kicked in once again. So going forward to December 12th, 2006, speaking about like preparedness and whatnot, were we prepared for this? Absolutely not. Were there signs? Absolutely. A couple weeks prior to December 12th, 2016, domestic disturbance had occurred at this establishment between the shooter and a young lady that worked there. They had been in a relationship. The relationship ended. He continued to go around till he was asked not to come back anymore. And he was a regular patron. He was there every day, every week. Of course, a fight ensued. The doorman, who I'll show you a picture of him, he was a victim in this incident, was the father of a child in common with this young lady. So he worked the door, she attended the bar, and this individual, Scott Medeiros, was dating her, and the relationship failed. Bobby Carrero, who was the doorman, said, hey, she doesn't want you to come back anymore. The fight ensued. Bobby was a rather larger guy, embarrassed Scott in the parking lot in front of his friends, in front of fellow patrons. Over those next couple of days and weeks, signs popped up to her via email, text messages, phone calls. Wait and see what happens. None of that was ever reported to us. So December 12th, 2006, start my regular shift. I wrote, at the time we had paper rosters. We didn't have computerized rosters. So I wrote Steve next to my name as my partner. So a little bit of guilt falls into that as well. So night starts going around 2 o'clock in the morning. We receive a call for shots fired at the Foxy Lady, which, of those of you that don't know, is a gentleman's club, or just put it plainly, a strip club that we had on Pope's Island. Now, Pope's Island is connected by 2 bridges on either side. One connected back to the city of New Bedford, and the other side connects to the town of Fairhaven. So we received that call for shots fired. At the time, to put it plainly, we had gang issues at that location. So I shrugged my shoulders. It wasn't my area. I boarded that area for my patrol area. So I said, all right, well, shots fired. We get shots fired a lot. So I didn't really put much stock into it. Then the call came out even heavier that there were more shots fired. So as I was driving, we drove there. I in turn took a round to the face, not even knowing where the shooter was, because I was complacent. I was looking at the door. Every time that we went there, I looked at the door, the main door. We entered that door for calls. I know that was the main entrance, not knowing that he was at a different door and he just had the perfect line of sight on us. So going back, this is the shooter, Scott Medeiros. And a lot of people might ask, or they have asked me in the past, how do you look at him? I don't have any hate for him. I don't want people to think like, oh my God, he hurt you, he tried to kill you. Why don't you despise him? Why don't you dislike him? Because I don't. The only hate I have for anyone is for myself. I put Steve in that car that night. I got Steve hurt. I wasn't the one paying attention. I got myself hurt. Well, potentially I could have got Steve killed or other officers that were arriving to assist me because of my complacency. I don't know what pushed Scott Medeiros to do that shooting that day. He ended up committing suicide shortly after this incident. He was in the building. He called 911 himself, identified himself as the shooter, and ended his own life. But I don't bear any ill will to him or his family. Things happen. A lot of people have told me, oh, it's part of the job. No, it's not part of the job. I expect that something might happen, but I didn't expect that potentially I would have left my children fatherless. On the right is Bobby Carrero. As I stated, that was the doorman. And on the left, Torrey Mirandis, he was the manager. They were all friends at one point. Scott Medeiros actually knew the building because he did the security and the video surveillance system inside, so he knew every nook and cranny in there. Knew that the Foxy Lady was a building inside of the building. The entertainment was on the inside, and then they had storage on the outside. So he knew that very well. He knew where he was going. But unfortunately, they were targets. He dressed all in black that night. He even backed his vehicle into a parking space, entered through a side entrance, walked in. There was a couple of young ladies that worked there. They were in the doorway, and he walked right by them, fully armed, and said, "I'm not here for you." And they ran out screaming. He went in there. He fired some shots, went out the front door, fired a shot into Bobby's groin, and then fired 5 into his head while he was on the ground. People started running out and driving. So, and again, we're getting 911 calls that there's a black vehicle leaving with no lights. That's a shooter. So, as I'm going there, I'm like trying to process all this information, and I got a new kid in the car. That's what, yeah, I might be new too, but in my mentality, this is my 4.5 years on. He's got 6 months on. Like, I got to guide him. And as we went to the call, it was just so much more information going out. And I see a vehicle go by the Foxy Lady, so I'm thinking that's the shooter. But I see one of the cruisers behind it. I said, well, I got to check on the victims. So as I'm pulling into the parking lot, just prior to pulling into the parking lot, Scott Medeiros had just shot Torrey Mirandis on the sidewalk. Torrey, I'm not going to play it here, but there's an audio of Torrey calling 911 and saying, I think the shooter just left. He had gone out the service entrance. He is banging on the door to say, hey, let me in, let me in. The shooter, Scott Medeiros, in turn opens the door. Torrey tries to run. Scott guns him down. That's when I'm pulling up. Scott was an avid shooter. He'd shoot all the time, more than guys in the police department do. We're only mandated to go to the range one time a year. You're on your own for everything else. So this guy was shooting actively. He knew guns. He knew how to set himself. He knew how to all the equipment that he had, he was ready for battle. He shoots through the windshield. One doctor said that the first hit was the lucky hit. And you'll see it in a picture in a second. The first round went through the windshield, was deflected by the windshield, took off a piece of my nose and entered my cheek and exited just out under my ear, and you'll see that photo. But anybody that, if you get hit in the face, your initial reactions just go down. You move your head down. So I didn't know what happened, and luckily I went down and I actually fractured my orbital bone on the computers we had in the car, because the second shot was a direct hit to the headrest. So if I had not gone down, I would have been killed. So let me get to that. So as you can see, that the top one on the right is actually that's the lucky shot, if you will. Because I didn't know what happened. To be quite honest, I thought we hit a rock, or a rock spit up and hit the windshield. And the first thing in my head is like, great, I got to do a report on a broken windshield now. I didn't realize how much I was bleeding. And so as I turned into the parking lot, he just shot. We were struck over 25 times. Steve Waterman was struck in the arm. You'll see that photo as well. And he was struck in the hip. I don't have that photo out of privacy, but you can see we were struck several times. And during this time was actually the shooter shot the radiator, so I was leaking radiator fluid. From here, I did drive me and Steve to the hospital. Our cruiser did basically die out right in the parking lot, so we just barely made it. I didn't realize how severe my injuries were. One piece of metal actually punctured my eye, went into the back of my eye. I didn't know much about anatomy back then, but your eye's full of fluid, and blood came in and actually blinded me in one eye. So I basically drove to the hospital, unable to hear properly because my ears were severely ringing, driving with one eye, and just hoping I could make it to safety and get him help. If you can make that out, that's the headrest with 2 shots in it. You know, when you cut yourself at home, you're like, oh, you know, stupid mistake. You cut yourself on a can lid or a piece of glass. But I didn't realize, like, it was nighttime. I was bleeding pretty good. And as I was driving away, I touched my face, and I saw blood on my hand. And a piece of metal actually chipped the top of my badge from him shooting the door, and embedded itself into my chest. So I thought I was more injured than what I was. And I just kept telling myself, don't pass out, don't freak out. You need to get Steve to safety. I took a lot of blame because I'm yelling at Steve, are you okay, you okay? And I can't hear him. You know, he's not moving, and I thought I had gotten him killed. I put this photograph here because we were probably about 150 feet away from him, and everybody knows how strong a tire rim is. And he shot that, you know, he had 223 rounds from an AR-15, and that went through that tire rim as if it were nothing. So just imagine if we had gotten out of the car, it would have been chaos. You can see by my picture, the one on the bottom left. To put a little humor in there, my sisters always told me I had a big nose when I was a kid. So coincidentally, a doctor I did not know said, you're lucky your nose is big because it saved your life. So I said, well, thank you for your medical opinion. So, but from this, from that injury, I've probably had about 12 surgeries to my face. My sinuses were punctured. If you look at my, like an x-ray of my face, it just has all like dots in it from him shooting the car and the metal exploding into my face. Steve's arm and his side is the same way. I lost a significant amount of hearing from this. So I mean, it just wasn't that. People think like, oh yeah, you recovered from that, but as Lisa said, there's so much to it afterward. This is Steve. Steve took a round right through the arm. You can see the entry up top and then the exit at the bottom. And he did take a round to the hip as well. Torrey, very nice guy. I had met him previous to this, but he got killed as we were pulling up. So again, too, I blame guilt on myself and blame myself because maybe if I'd gotten there sooner, maybe I could have done something. Robert Carrero as well, he was the doorman, Bobby Carrero. He had the child in common with the young lady that worked the bar. And Scott Medeiros, who ended up committing suicide shortly after calling 911 inside the club. This was the shooter's view. Those of you that are familiar with New Bedford, that's looking west. So right about where that white sign is in the parking lot, that's where we were as we were pulling in, and he had a perfect view. Our saving grace, if you want to use that phrase, was the service door didn't lock on him. When Torrey ran out after the shooting, he called 911 and he went back to bang on the door had locked behind him. Scott kicks the door open and Torrey takes off running, but luckily the door hadn't closed. Because if the door had closed, Scott would have been out there and we would have all been sitting ducks, every officer that was responding. So he actually used that door as cover. He was properly trained, used the door as cover, peeked out, and right behind this, you see it in this photo, it's a separate photo, was one of those green telephone boxes for the island. So he was using that as back cover. So the officers from Fairhaven that came to assist couldn't get a clear shot on him. So from this, I was mad at myself. I got transported to Rhode Island Hospital. From St. Luke's Hospital. I thought my career was done at 27 years old. Previous to that, it was kind of a succession. 2005, I lost my father. I was actually working, and I heard the call. over the radio for a 68-year-old male not breathing at my parents' address. And I'm like, and it took me a second, and I rushed there, and by the time I got there, he had passed away. And I put blame on myself because I only lived 6 blocks over. Like maybe if I had been closer, maybe if I'd been home instead of working a detail, because I wanted that extra money for my kids. I wanted to, take them on vacation, whatever the case was. Maybe if I had been home, I could have performed CPR. A year before that, 2004, my brother drowned in a whitewater rafting accident. And then the year before that, I lost a sister. So it was so much year after year. So when this occurred, like I just had so much on my plate from home, from work, trying to go to school, and it takes a toll. I wasn't like after this, like just being home, I was so used to working, having my routine. My family suffered, my kids suffered. I didn't want to deal with anyone, I didn't want to see anyone. I felt a lot of guilt with Steve being out. He was a new kid. He wasn't even from the area. He transferred down here transferred down to New Bedford to work. So it takes a toll on you. It eats at you. And people are like, oh well, you got received all these awards and all these accommodations. Well, that's not going to bring back who I was. That's not going to bring back the people that passed away. And you could get, every award under the sun. It doesn't matter. It doesn't take back what occurred. And me and Steve had talked, though, in the meantime, and I told him, I said, I got to get back to work. This is driving me crazy. It's not so much driving just me crazy, driving my family crazy. And it affected everyone. So me and Steve made a pact to go back to work, and 5 months later, we went back to work. Was it too soon? I don't know. I didn't go to counseling. It wasn't offered at the time. There was no help. It was just kind of, as Lisa said, that type A personality. I don't need help. I don't want it, which I should have. I should have gone help at the time. It ate at me for the longest time. Like I said, I hated myself. I couldn't even look at myself in the mirror to shave. That's how embarrassed I was of looking at myself. A lot of people still ask me about my scar. They're like I shaved yesterday, and my scar's real fragile. And my daughter, who's now 10, she said, "Dad, what happened to your scar?" And I don't even like hearing the word. To be honest with you, I don't even like using the word. But and it took me a second. I'm like, "Oh, but buddy, I cut myself shaving." She's like, "Okay," and it wasn't anything malicious. She was just concerned about it. But does it bother me every day? Absolutely. I used to sing. Not that I was a great singer, but I used to sing. And after this incident occurred, and I lost hearing, it bothered me because I knew I couldn't catch a tone anymore, and it was something I loved to do. That was like a desire of mine. It was to sing at parties, at functions. I loved to do it, and then I realized I wasn't the same person, and it eats at you. It bothers you, and it affected my family, affected my home life, my marriage, my relationship with my kids. It's affected it now. My twins are now 17. My next daughter is 15 and a half, and the little one's 10. And over the years, as much as I tried to make up for the time of how much I wasn't there because I was in my own world, it's not going to make a difference. I mean, don't get me wrong. My kids, I know they love me, but it's they're ready to move on and do their own thing, and I'm waiting in the wings. I'm just watching as life's going by. Because it's not so much like, hey, Dad, I need you. It's like, hey, Dad, what are you doing here? And does it bother you? Absolutely. Because I knew that day would come, but I didn't think it was going to come based on my actions of how poor of a father I was. And I regret that every day. Probably if I'd put more stock, and that's why I use that word complacency, I put more stock into my family, especially after this incident, to let this affect me the way it did, put a strain on so much. So what did we learn from this department? At the time, we didn't even have AR-15s, which majority of departments, larger departments had in their vehicles. In the radio transmission, you can hear the supervisor asking someone to go get the AR-15 from the station to bring to this scene, because all we had was firearms, sidearms, and shotguns. So we were outgunned. Luckily, no one else got hurt from the police department side. I'm grateful for that. But in the end, mentally, a lot of people got hurt because no one ever expected this. You know, you know that something's going to happen. You see it in the movies. You hear stories from around the nation. We had shootings in New Bedford, but you never thought it was going to happen to you in your career. A lot of guys have said, you know, if you can go a career without shooting someone or getting shot at, that was a good career. Well, this is my 17th year, and after this, though, the only good thing that I did focus on was to get my education. I ended up getting my master's degree as well. I got promoted to sergeant in January of 2013, which was a big boost for me mentally. Took me a little bit to get on board and get on the right track, but I straightened my ways. If I can take anything from this, it's probably, and if I can say it to anybody else, especially a newer officer that's coming on the job, is to, one, to take care of themselves, but also not to be complacent in the fact that there's other aspects of your life that move with you. And if you're moving without them, you're going to miss out, you're going to lose out. So that's basically it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Josh. Next, we have Todd McGee. Todd's an active shooter and international anti-terrorism trainer, homeland security expert, and news media security analyst. He retired from the Massachusetts State Police after serving for more than 2 decades. He's currently the managing partner of Protecting the Homeland Innovations training firm. He's an international speaker on counterterrorism, violent extremism, and a highly respected authority in the field of proactive threat mitigation strategies. He's successfully authored, developed, and delivered the Active Shooter Awareness course designed to prepare civilians and private security professionals. Todd, please.
Thank you, Dr. Cox. Before I begin my piece of the presentation, I just want to thank both Lisa and Josh for sharing their experiences and what they've gone through. That comes from a very, very deep part of them, and to really be up here exposed, sharing about their different situations, I just want to thank you and appreciate what you shared. So, first of all, it's an honor to be here today in front of this assembly and be a part of this panel with my colleagues. A little background about myself. I started my law enforcement career in 1987, and I worked various assignments within the state police. I was an arson investigator. I had worked at the State Police Academy as a drill instructor, as a defensive tactics coordinator, and I want to fast forward to 2001, when 2 planes left Logan Airport and the events of 9/11 started to unfold. I was part of one of 82 troopers that put in for a transfer to be assigned at Logan International Airport. As most of you know, we have a barracks there. At the time, pre-9/11, there was approximately 82 troopers, and 60 to 62 troopers, and then adding in the 80 plus additional troopers, there's approximately 143 troopers there, and that complement is still maintained today post 9/11. So part of that experience, I completed my last 10 years of my career at Logan Airport, and I was part of a small training team. And our goal was to train, our initial goal was to train the state troopers to understand and recognize strange and suspicious behavior, but how to respond to it proactively. We had already seen reactiveness, we had already seen with complacency, to Josh's point, we could see how those different areas really were fail points within the security of protecting Logan Airport. So we rolled out the training. We came up with the training program. The training program was designed to focus on human behavior and to behavior profile, to be very more specific about it. So we rolled out that training, and it was received very, very well by the troopers at Logan Airport. As soon as that training was completed, we realized it wasn't enough. and we started to look at ways on how to create force multipliers. So we came up with a civilianized version, and we started training our tenants, the airlines, our contractors, any private vendor that was providing services to Massport Authority, and also the state employees. All 17,000 tenants, contractors, employees have gone through security awareness training to begin to recognize and understand what suspicious behavior looks like. Fast forward to the end of my career, I retired in April of 2011, coming up on my 8th year of retirement. In 2015, I had the opportunity to write a course, a behavior recognition course for the federal government. The course was piloted in Kingston, Jamaica, and from there I've traveled around the world to the Caribbean, to Tajikistan. So if you look at the map and find Afghanistan, it's the country to the right. It's a Muslim nation. I've gone to Malaysia twice. I've been to the Philippines twice. I've been to Chiang Mai, Thailand. January of 2019, I'm scheduled to go to Senegal. February of 2019, I'm scheduled to go back to Bangladesh for a second time. This year I've been to Ethiopia. In April, I spent the whole entire month of April in Philippines. I don't say that to impress you. I say that to impress upon you the single one global concern, first-hand experience, is homegrown extremism. Single one concern, whether you're in Ethiopia, whether you're in Chiang Mai, Thailand, whether you're in Manila, Philippines, homegrown extremism are right here in Massachusetts. So we're trying to wrap our minds around what is going on. If I had more time for my slide presentation, I could show you the trajectory from year 2000, when the FBI started monitoring and watching these particular incidents, until 2017. The trajectory just continues to climb. Here we are in 2018, and we've already surpassed 2017 statistics for active threats, active shooters. I want to leave enough time for my colleague, Professor Duncan, but I want to leave you with 4 things. The first is going to come in a package of 3. I want to share with you ideology, catalysts, and grievances. If you apply those 3 factors in every single case study, I'm going to give you an example. You apply those 3 factors in every single case study, you will start to see the trends, and you'll start to see what we like to say, the term connect the dots. We have to get away from connecting the dots and recognize that the dots are actually indicators. The indicators show themselves, but oftentimes we're missing those provocative statements. We're missing the behavior cues. And we need to act on those indicators and those behavior cues. Starting with catalysts. Catalysts are push factors that bring people towards violence. There's a common myth that active shooters or people that have committed a violent extremist act just snap. Well, the fact is that catalysts take time. Oftentimes it takes years before a person finds that place where they end up committing a horrific act. Things such as death of a loved one, divorce, separation from children from a difficult divorce, loss of wages, garnished wages by the IRS. These are all push factors. Now, all of us in this assembly, we've all had some type of trauma or some type of incident that's ongoing in our lives, but we get through it. But there's a pocket of people in our society that those cycles continue in their lives, and they don't have the grounding to be able to get through them. Next is ideology. Ideology is an extreme passion or belief system in that belief system. Also, ideology people tend to identify themselves with their ideology. Next is grievance, a perceived wrongdoing against myself by a person or an organization. So I give you these first 3 factors to consider, because if we can recognize these first 3 factors exhibited by a person, then perhaps we can have a mental health response rather than miss those 3 factors, and then we have a criminal justice response. The 4th factor I want to leave with you is for you to consider the sense of mobilization. If we miss those aspects, then it will be a law enforcement response indeed. So I'm going to end my time now, and I look forward to your questions during our panel discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Todd. Finally, we have Dwight Duncan. Professor Duncan is an honors graduate of Georgetown University Law Center. He's a native Washingtonian where he practiced law. Professor Duncan has written articles on legal, moral, and religious issues. He's argued several cases before the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court and the Appeals Court, and has written briefs for the U.S. Supreme Court. He's a member of the Massachusetts and the Washington, D.C. bars, and is a faculty member for the UMass School of Law, where he teaches constitutional law. Please welcome Professor Duncan.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be sitting down just so you don't have high expectations, because we've heard from really great speakers about who have, kind of real personal experience with the issue. And my experience with this issue is just in the classroom. So it's all theory. But I hope to just say a couple of words actually about the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution and what relevance it might have to this discussion. As you probably know, the Second Amendment, which is the second provision of the Bill of Rights that was ratified in 1791, it basically said that a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. As I think it's pretty clear from the wording of the Second Amendment, it's a bit ambiguous as to what we're really talking about. That is, are we talking about having a well-regulated citizen militia, or are we talking about an individual right to have firearms? And interestingly enough, that question was only resolved by the United States Supreme Court 10 years ago in a case called District of Columbia versus Heller, in which the Supreme Court decided, in a famous opinion written by Justice Scalia, decided 5-4, so it was a closely decided case, a split decision, that basically the Second Amendment involved an individual right to possess a handgun within one's house for the purposes of self-defense, as opposed to the dissent, which argued that it was only, the Second Amendment really only concerned the ability of militias or military establishments to have firearms, which would make really the Second Amendment a kind of almost like a dead letter in the Constitution, because it would make it like the Third Amendment. You never hear anything about the Third Amendment, which says that, excuse me, you don't have to quarter troops in your house in times of peace. But anyway, 2 years after the Heller decision, the Supreme Court decided in a case of out of Chicago called McDonald versus the city of Chicago, that the Second Amendment applies not just to the federal government and federal regulations, but also to state and local governments and their regulations. Excuse me. Now, one thing that's important to understand is that the Second Amendment does not involve an absolute right, or as Justice Scalia wrote in 2008, he says, like most rights, the Second Amendment is not unlimited. He says, nothing in our opinion should be taken to cast doubt on the long-standing prohibitions on the possession of firearms by felons and the mentally ill, or laws forbidding the carrying of firearms in sensitive places, such as schools and government buildings, or laws imposing conditions and qualifications on the commercial sale of arms. So my point is that reasonable regulation of gun ownership is fully consistent with the Second Amendment, even as interpreted by this Supreme Court. I do think that the interpretation of the Second Amendment as involving some kind of individual right to keep and bear arms, I think that's, for the time being and for the foreseeable future, I think that's going to stay. But like I said, reasonable regulations are allowed. So, for example, prohibitions on concealed carry are perfectly fine. And in fact, in the 10 years that the Supreme Court has interpreted the Second Amendment to involve this individual right, relatively few gun regulations have been declared unconstitutional. I'm thinking one is the state of Illinois had a total ban on open carry that was ruled inconsistent with the Second Amendment. And in 2016, there was a Massachusetts law that banned stun guns across the board, and the U.S. Supreme Court basically said that that ban violated the Second Amendment, and thus made it clear that the Second Amendment doesn't simply apply to types of arms or weapons or firearms that existed, in 1791, because at that time, I guess there were no stun guns. And it gets back to what the purpose of the Second Amendment was, I think, which is to have firearms for purposes of self-defense and defense of one's home and family, to have firearms for purposes of hunting, and finally, another aspect was basically to have guns available to ward off political oppression, right? So I think you don't have to know much about the American Revolution and, let's say, the opening shots in the American Revolution, the Battle of Lexington and Concord, to realize that was because British regular troops were marching on Concord to seize a supply of weapons. And they were met by basically bands of citizen militias from the countryside. And that was the opening scene in the American Revolution. So there's a certain sense in which I think the Second Amendment is very consistent with that understanding. Or the other interesting moment, I think, in our constitutional history is after the Civil War and Reconstruction, right? One of the things that was going on once the federal troops were withdrawn from the South is that there was rather systematic denial of African American voting rights. There was, of course, the regime of segregation. There was all things like lynching, but what you have to understand is this was accompanied by a systematic effort to take arms and weapons out of the hands of African Americans, because it seems to me things like lynching would have been much more problematic, right, had people been able to defend themselves, right, with force of arms. So anyway, I just think that there is this role that guns have had, but at the same time, it's quite clear that reasonable regulations of firearms are constitutional. So I think that's kind of the basic legal framework, and I don't really want to beat it to death, but maybe in the question period, people have particular concerns, they can come up. Thank you.
Thank you, Dwight. At this point, I would ask that our volunteers with the note cards, if you could make them available, if people would like to write some questions and then pass them to the end of their rows to be collected. I want to start off with a question that I'll pose first to Lisa and Josh. And it's really, with more than a decade that has passed since your events that you've survived, what's your takeaway on how things have changed and what needs to happen moving forward from your perspectives?
You can go first.
Actually, I'll be honest with you. I don't think a lot of things have changed, with the exception of law enforcement boosting their equipment and whatnot. But the thought process remains the same. As you have in your heading, after an incident, it's thoughts and prayers, but eventually that runs out. Like, what are you going to do next? What is your next step? And as it was stated, there are identifiers out there, but people don't want to see them. People don't want to, they don't want to call up and say, hey, this is what I believe is going on. No one's gonna question you on the fact if you give us a little information. We'll look into it. Law enforcement will look into it. And hopefully, if it's nothing, it's nothing. But if it is something, maybe it could, stop another attack, another incident with people, so people don't get hurt or killed. But again, I don't think anything's changed, with the exception of people become laxed. An incident occurs, it's the thoughts and prayers, it's the vigil, and then they're back to the same routine as if it was wiped off the board.
I'd agree with that. I think that we kind of get stuck in like this hamster wheel where we can't get out of this discussion between, gun policy changes and mental health reform, that we forget that there's other, avenues in which we can move forward. And that's, changes to our infrastructure, changes to training, educating law enforcement, training civilians what to do in an active shooter situation. So I think we've made some progress there when it comes to infrastructure, training, and education, but it's very regionalized. So, for example, now if you go to Virginia Tech, the infrastructure is different. If you go to Sandy Hook, they have a brand new school that a lot of money went into, but in the areas where incidents have occurred is where we're starting to see change and around them. But if it hasn't happened in your community, you still think you're in this bubble of it can't happen. And by being honest with, okay, maybe it could happen here, and figuring out what you're going to do, you're actually making yourself more vulnerable by not wanting to have that conversation.
Todd, I got a sort of long question here for you, but examining the June 2018 FBI study on pre-attack behaviors of active shooters, only 25% in the study had ever been diagnosed with a mental illness. However, they typically experienced multiple stressors in the year before they attacked. On average, each shooter displayed 4 to 5 concerning behaviors over time that were observable by others, most frequently related to mental health, problematic interpersonal interactions, and signs of violent intent. As we have the opportunity to go back and look at trends from the events that have transpired and the perpetrators who did them, is there a body of knowledge that we can build upon from the research and from the data, augmenting intelligence to help more accurately predict who's most likely to commit these crimes and find out about it in a timely manner?
So let me respond with the first publication released by the FBI dating back 2000 to year 2013. The first case study was year 2000, the Michael McDermott Edgewater Technology case study. And in that, there were, as I had mentioned, catalysts. In that particular case study, the catalysts for Michael McDermott were he ran into financial difficulties. The incident was sometime around the holidays. He had gone to accounting and HR and requested a cash advancement or a pay advance. He was denied that action because the IRS had already started wage garnishments through the accounting department. He then, they believed that he had planted firearms within the workplace, came into work the very next day, or shortly thereafter, and then started a shooting spree. So there was this process in his life that went over a period of time. There's a myth that people snap, in that the person that people will say that we never saw the indicators. Well, the indicators do show themselves. The second report released by the FBI most recently that you've referred to started to look at the different trends. And it started looking at certain personality disorders, one of which was called aggressive narcissism. Aggressive narcissism revealed that these were individuals that were extremely hostile towards neighbors, towards coworkers. They were typically abusers within domestic relationships, and they were also exhibited signs of cruelty to animals. 82% of the individuals in active shooter incidents studied from year 2000 to 2017 had this personality disorder. The other issues that were brought up in that report were specific to provocative statements. Businesses were known as the #1 place where violence, extreme violence, has been targeted. So things such as an employee being off-boarded, things such as an employee being terminated and making provocative statements as they were being escorted off property. Those were fail points because when those provocative statements were made, people either didn't take them serious or someone turned a deaf ear to those particular statements. And that was approximately 79% of people had made those provocative statements. Another statistic that was also interesting was somewhere between 75 and 79% these individuals had exhibited behavior signs that were concerning to others. So oftentimes people are seeing the indicators, but they're not making that phone call to law enforcement. And I've heard, coming from a police perspective, I've heard years and years and years, well, the police are busy. They're not going to have time to come out and take a look at this particular call. Please, if that is a thought that you've ever had, please remove it. And I'm sure Josh would be able to second that. It's important that we have some level of information from your community, from the things that you're seeing firsthand, so that, again, we put an individual that's troubled and put them on radar. And to close out the response to the question, there's really the aspect of being able to stop the fail points. And I'll give you the case of Nicholas Cruz. The catalyst in his life started well in his tender age of 4 years old, where he lost his father. November 1st, 2017, he lost his mother. He had 35 to 39 interactions with law enforcement based on his behavior, and the last education institution that he was thrown out of was the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas School, where he targeted. So you can see where the catalyst ideology and the grievances will apply in that particular case. So we're only as smart as our last incidents, and that's why I share these different perspectives with you, so that we can begin to understand what the indicators are, and then hopefully be able to respond in kind to what those indicators are before an individual gets to a stage of mobilization.
Are you optimistic that we'll eventually get to a point where we'll be able to more accurately predict before the incident occurs?
There are common denominators. I'm a glass is half full type of perspective. I think we will, but it takes collective body. Right. Discussions like this are essential for us to be able to process information. But then after we process the information, we have to begin to put systems in place. So once there is a report or a concern in an individual that may appear to be risked towards extreme violent behavior, there's an intervention team that now can go ahead, reach out to this person, understand what's troubling them, and then be able to get them the appropriate resources before they, again, before another fail point presents itself.
Thank you. Dwight, in 1992, former Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, Warren Burger, wrote an article about the Second Amendment. And let me quote, and this is a somewhat long quote, it's his abstract to the article to help frame the next question. And I'm quoting, "The Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution guarantees a right of the people to keep and bear arms. However, the meaning of this clause cannot be understood apart from the purpose, the setting, and the objectives of the draftsman. At the time of the Bill of Rights, people were apprehensive about the new national government presented to them, and this helps explain the language and purpose of the Second Amendment. It guarantees a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The need for a state militia was the predicate of the right guarantee, so as to protect the security of the state. Today, of course, the state militia serves a different purpose. A huge national defense establishment has assumed the role of the militia of 200 years ago. Americans have a right to defend their homes, and nothing should undermine this right. Nor does anyone question that the Constitution protects the right of hunters to own and keep sporting guns for hunting any more than anyone would challenge the right to own and keep fishing rods and other equipment for fishing. Neither does anyone question the right of citizens to keep and own an automobile. Yet there is no strong interest by the citizenry in questioning the power of the state to regulate and purchase or the transfer of such a vehicle and the right to license the vehicle and the driver with reasonable standards. It is even more desirable for the state to have reasonable regulations for the ownership and use of a firearm in an effort to stop mindless homicidal carnage, and that's an unquote. Understanding that the Constitution is often referred to as a living document, if the framers were constructing the Bill of Rights today, how would the Second Amendment read?
Yeah, that's a good question, but my sense of it, I agree with pretty much everything that Chief Justice Berger wrote there, that you just quoted. The problem is that, and I think there is this issue, right, that while the purposes of self-defense or defense of one's home or hunting, those reasons are still quite valid and valid as they were at the time of the framing of the Constitution. The role of citizen militias vis-a-vis the standing army are quite different now, right? It's inconceivable, right, that people with their handguns or whatever, or even rifles, could get together and essentially be some kind of counterweight to all of America's military might. I mean, nobody would think that the Second Amendment involves a right to have nuclear weapons, right? Or even, I think, automatic weapons, machine guns, these kinds of things, right? But of course, the military has all that stuff. And so there's no way that we could somehow, I think, that private militias could somehow take on the federal military. So I agree that that's a problem now. I guess the point is, though, we don't have an ongoing constitutional convention, right? So we're not in a position, basically, to rewrite the Second Amendment. What we are in a position to do, conceivably, is to amend it. But the problem is, it's extremely difficult to amend the federal Constitution because you need repeated supermajorities, and for any controversial issue, that's impossible. That's virtually impossible to obtain. So the point is, the Second Amendment is not going to be. I don't think it's going to be amended, right? That being the case, then the question is, how do you interpret the Second Amendment? And this is where, we get into the composition of the U.S. Supreme Court. And like I say, their decision that it entails this individual right, I think it's going to be there for the foreseeable future, given the current composition of the court, right? So I guess what I'm saying is, I don't think we're in a position to really rewrite the Second Amendment now, right? And even if we did, I'm not entirely sure how we could do it, because I think there's a certain sense in which, the right of self-defense by force if necessary, and the idea that government should not have a monopoly on force, right? I think those are two related ideas, actually, that are sort of written into the Second Amendment. And I think both those ideas are valuable ideas, well worth preserving. But anyway, I sort of beg the question.
I'm going to add something. So I think that, I mean, maybe it's just me, but we'd all agree that for 99.9% of the people, it doesn't matter to me whether they have a gun for self-defense or for hunting, it doesn't matter. But that 0.001% that's going to do something to hurt another individual is those are the people we want to get the guns out of their hands. So it's like, how do we connect the mental health and all of the see something, say something, okay, we have this information on this individual, it's leading towards something that looks like something bad could happen, and connecting it with the gun policy laws so that it's just taking the guns out of the hands of the wrong people. I think that there needs to be some connection there. I don't know how it's done or what process you create, but I feel like that might be a missing piece. Just throwing it out there.
That's what we're looking for today, the solution of that. It would go really far, and I think it goes back to what Todd was talking about earlier in the work with the research and the FBI and trying to determine those parameters proactively, and maybe one day we come up with the algorithm that works and that there's that system in place where people know where to get the information and there's a way to apply it.
You know, just to piggyback on what Lisa had expressed, we're a culture that we're 350 million within the United States. Statistically, there are more weapons in the United States than there are citizens. So, again, we can point to the Second Amendment, but the reality is that guns are in our community. We have good people with guns, we have bad people with guns that have access to guns. And so, you know, the horse has already left the barn. And so we're already in a reactive role in trying to play catch up. And we really have to take a hard look at mental illness in our country and really come together and find new solutions on how to manage mental health. Again, from a law enforcement perspective, I was talking to Josh about this prior to our session, in that law enforcement is called for into a community based on someone's behavior. We are not mental health professionals. We are not properly trained at all to be able to respond to mental health. So in the best response with notifying law enforcement, that response is already at a fail point, because our only option most times is arrest, or if there's some type of a facility that's nearby, then maybe there's some type of 48 or 72-hour observation. But what happens on the 73rd hour? That person's back out in the street. So we have to really take a hard look at overhauling our entire system around mental health. And then, what is mental health? Does mental health mean because I've been clinically diagnosed that I have a disorder? Or what about when I've gone through all these different challenges of my life where I've lost a job, I can't provide for my family, my home's being foreclosed? That can make a person go crazy. You know, so again, I think we really have to take a hard look at our complete systemic system and how we respond when we have these different incidents.
Josh, you spoke a little bit about when the first call came in of shots fired and there was the hesitancy, and then the next call came that there were shots fired. And I'm wondering, for anyone in the likelihood, the potential of ever being caught in that situation, from a standpoint of maybe personal responsibility, is the expectation that we should all learn to become our initial first responder when something's going down, that given the timeline that it takes law enforcement to arrive when something occurs, we need to be cognizant of that and plan accordingly.
I tell, in a lot of the speeches I tell at the police academies, it's our job to protect the public and protect one another, but I never ask anyone to be a hero. And although we have to be prepared, I mean, everyone has a resource now, and it's their cell phone. And I'm pretty sure everyone in this room has one on them right now. And all it takes is a call to 911. But I wouldn't ask, unless unless you're trying to protect your own life, the life of your significant other, your child, no one's asking you to be a hero, but would you have to act in a situation? I use this, we do a lot of the national mantra now is ALICE training for a lot of schools, a lot of buildings. And when we do it in New Bedford, and I speak to a lot of the teachers, because we do it in the schools, I say, don't just utilize this for your teacher life, your teacher profession. You can use this in every aspect of your day. It'd be no different if somebody was trying to come up behind me as I'm putting groceries in my trunk and sticks a knife in my back. What are you gonna do? You have to make that decision at that point. Like as I was responding to that call, my mental mindset was either the shooters are gonna be gone, as they normally are by the time we arrive, or somebody's gonna be dead. But I wasn't expecting the severity that it did occur. But the best asset you have is using your senses, giving information as best you can. Everything from where you are to where you last saw that person, what they were dressed, everything. It's basically, you're playing the movie back to the law enforcement or the dispatcher that's taking that information to help assist. But again, my main statement to that is, I never ask anyone to be a hero. You have to do what you can do to protect yourself, but I'd hate to see someone get hurt because they want to go to that level.
Thank you. Lisa, you spoke a little bit about the infrastructure and the design, and thinking back to that computer science room that you were in, if you had the opportunity to maybe provide feedback on the design of a new science and engineering building, what aspects would you advocate for to include that we may not ordinarily think about?
The locked door is like my number one thing. A locked door can go such a long way, but it's so simple, but it also has to be done right. So it needs to lock from the inside. The lock shouldn't have any keys, because in the event of an emergency, you don't have time to go find the keys. And if you're a substitute teacher in a school, you may not have been given keys in the beginning of the day. So now you have nothing. Your lock is basically useless. So it really just needs to be a push lock from the indoor. So that's, easy to lock the door and keep the protruder out, as well as if the threat is in the classroom, it's easy to get out. You open the door and you're out. So I'm a big advocate for locked doors, as well as just training. So you mentioned Alice, there's run, hide, fight, there's avoid, deny, defend. There's different models for citizens on how to respond to active shooters. And instead of contrasting these and seeing how they're different, I think we should look at how they're alike. And what's alike in them is that they're options-based, because there's not always going to be one option in the event of an active shooter that is going to be the option. That would make it easy, right? Like if we could always just do this one thing. But it's going to be very situational, based on the situation and based on the environment. So it's going to be sometimes run, sometimes hide, sometimes build a barricade, sometimes jump out windows, and it's going to be like a matrix of all these different options you have. And as the emergency is unfolding, you're also going to need to be continuing to be reevaluating. Okay, in the beginning it was best to hide because this is where the shooter was, but now things have changed, a couple of minutes have gone on. Is that still the best thing? Or now do I have the option to go run somewhere? And that continued evaluation until law enforcement gets there.
That'll be very useful for us. We're building a new building.
Just to piggyback on what Lisa said, that importance for the locking mechanism. Mm-hmm. If you find yourself in an environment that is strictly a keyed access control, and I'm not talking about credentials, but a physical key, under stress, you come in and out of that workspace every day, or that classroom space, you gain access into the building or into the classroom with a key. Under extreme stress, those fine motor skills are going to deteriorate. And so when Lisa had mentioned having a push button type of an option, or some type of gross motor skill movement to secure the door, that's essential. Because again, under stress, the physiological changes that happen in the human body will fail you, and you'll find yourself dropping keys, fumbling, and if the threat's coming near, that anxiety is only going to increase.
Thank you. Todd, this question actually comes from one of our professors, Jeannie Yarich, and she asked, should ending violence be our goal in terms of the outcomes we seek? Or should we instead focus our energy on promoting compassion, gratitude, and civility? Can we improve our outcomes by implementing conditions in which violence makes little sense?
Okay, I would start by answering that from the perspective, and I want to paint the picture. I'll use myself as the example. If I am your colleague, I tend to be a loner, I tend to be socially awkward. Typically, the response is that I won't be engaged by my colleagues, my classmates. I'm left, and I'm going to use the word shun, it's a strong word, but typically the profile of that individual I just painted for you, that person is left alone. We need to ask, why is that person socially awkward? Why is that person exhibiting the behavior that they're exhibiting? And I think instead of shunning and pushing that person away, we should be showing compassion, and we should be engaging that person to understand what's going on in that person's life. And once we begin to maybe embrace the socially awkward people within our community and our society, we'll begin to have a deeper and better understanding about the different types and forms of mental illness. The next part, if I were to give you, from the perspectives of school shooters, from individuals who were once victims of being bullied, and I can bring you all the way back to the Columbine incident where Klebold and Harris both were bullied, and they found their ideology in something that they crafted, the trench coat mafia. That was their new persona, that was their new identity. And what they were trying to do was take back power in their life that they lost. And where I'm going with this is, if you can remember in that case study, who did they have on the hit list? The jocks and the popular kids. Most likely those are the ones that bullied them at some point in their adolescence, and they wanted to get that power back in their life, so they acted out. Also, that commonality in that, there's another case study from Alaska. Evan Ramsey, he had been bullied, he had lived in foster homes, several foster homes, and he talked about trying to get that sense of power back in his life. Now again, I'm not justifying their actions, but we need to ask the question, how do these individuals get that way? So if we begin to embrace, find a sense of compassion, maybe we can get out in front of some of these different potential incidents.
I want to thank the audience for the questions we have here, and we'll start with them. Do you think teachers in schools should be armed? And why don't we start with Dwight?
You know, I've never really liked guns. You know, they kind of make me nervous, just the idea of them. So I guess I'm not a big fan of that proposal, but I don't, you know, I don't think, at law school, I don't think it's a good idea, but I don't really know.
I don't like the idea. My wife is an educator. She currently works administratively in a school. However, her days in the classroom, I believe that teachers should be allowed to educate our students. I met a gentleman from the state of Texas who had mentioned that the program that is in place in certain schools with guns that have adopted that policy, the weapon is secured in a lockbox and locked, almost like, think of a fire, some type of fire suppression system, locked cabinet. Once the cabinet is opened, it's a ring down directly to the police department. Once the police department responds on property of the school, the weapon is relinquished by the trained person. Not every teacher has access to the weapon system, but that's how it's been managed in certain schools around the country. Just again, if you haven't heard of that, that's how it's being managed around the country in certain places.
I'm against it. As you know, in the police academy, the one thing they teach you, and it's kind of a trick question, they say when you go to a call, how many guns are there? And a lot of the newer officers, or the recruits rather, will say, well, I don't know, but there's always one. There's always the one that you bring. So if there's a teacher that's armed that forgets it somewhere, misplaces it, whatever the case might be, where did that gun go? Now there's a student out there that has a gun, potential shooter, that could harm others. There's a lot of training that comes to it. A lot of people, the first thing after these major incidents occur, they say, I'm gonna go get my gun license. But it's not, it's a responsibility. And a lot of people don't take that responsibility seriously. So I'd hate to have teachers, if I'm in the schools right now, I'm the school resource supervisor, I'd hate to have 200 teachers armed, and then that one time of, I lost my firearm, now you're backtracking. So I'm against it.
I'm against the idea as well. I'm with Dwight. Guns make me feel uncomfortable. I don't like being around guns. But what I do like is school resource officers and SROs. So I am all on board for that school resource officer being armed because he is trained and knows how to use it. And you know, there's evidence behind school resource officers ending school shootings very quickly, ones we don't even hear about because the school resource officer was on campus, was on the school, and after first or second shots fired, he was there to end the event. And I didn't know what school resource officers were until I really got into this. It's a school police officer. They just call them school resource officers because it's more friendly to the kids.
Just drilling down a little bit more on the response at Virginia Tech and taking a segue off of one of the questions here. The use of cell phones and the messaging at the time, given it's 10 years ago, was that a major part that students were trained to expect in the event of an emergency?
They did send us an email. So the first incident happened at around 7, and then it was during that 9 o'clock class period, somewhere around 9:30, Virginia Tech sent an email letting us know this first incident had happened. But at that point, we're already in class, mid-lecture, nobody's looking at their phones. And also at that time in 2007, phones and email weren't connected like they are today. So in order for me to go and check my email required going to a computer somewhere else, like a computer lab, or back to my apartment. So mass notifications can do a lot of good, specifically when it comes to notifying people who aren't on scene. Are the people you care about, you know, your spouses, your children, your parents, are they okay? And that's getting the notification to them. The people who are on scene, their notification is going to be hearing the gunshots. Or their notification is going to be someone running down the hall, locking doors, saying, you know, there's a shooter in the building. It's not like you expect when a fire drill happens, you know, you're gonna hear the fire alarm go off. In an active shooter drill, I think there are alarms that kind of can go off over the PA system that say, you know, active shooter. But typically, when a shooter goes into a building, the first people he's going to run into are the secretary and the administrative people. Those are the people who would push the button to send that PA alarm and notify everybody. So the notifications for those people that are there are just the sounds of the tragedy.
Thank you. Josh, what changes has the New Bedford Police Department made in training and recovery since the Foxy Lady incident?
As I stated in my presentation, we didn't have patrol rifles in the vehicles. All we had was shotguns at the time. Shortly thereafter, with the exception of having a patrol rifle at each station that was locked, that an individual will have to go get the key, unlock it, then bring it back to an active scene. We started training with the patrol rifles. Each cruiser, mainline cruiser, has a patrol rifle in their vehicle. The patrol officers are trained yearly in the use of them. They had to check them prior to each shift, make sure they're in working order. There's a lot of other trainings we've done as far as active shooter training, incidents like issues like that. But there's always a need for more. As Lisa stated, I didn't really know much about school resources when I was school resource officer when I was a child, but the expansion of that, especially in our city, with 22 schools, I think is essential. We don't have 22 school resource officers, but down the road, I think the use of it in schools as a security issue, as a safety issue, is prominent. I think it's a good idea, but again, a lot of it's training, and a lot of law enforcement departments just need training to get people to train, to get people to embed in their mind that this can happen anytime, anywhere.
Thank you. This is a question I'd like to pose to everyone. How can we as a society bridge the gap between pro-gun, anti-gun camps, paving a way toward actual reduction in these incidents?
I would respond, difficult challenge. People are passionate about their viewpoints. And oftentimes we hear the debate for pro-Second Amendment response in a very vigorous, robust response. We see the NRA, very, very powerful organization with a lot of money backing political candidates. And then we have our new vocal high school student population, specifically from the Parkland shooting, Parkland, Florida shooting from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, where they identify themselves as a school shooter generation. So it's a very, very complex debate. I think for us to have civil discord and be able to find the commonalities and look for common ground rather than our differences may be a starting place. And it's not to criticize anyone that's pro-gun or anyone that's anti-gun in our community, because there's such strong advocacy on both sides of the conversation. But I think we need to begin to find commonalities on where we can find level ground to begin the conversation.
Well, I was just going to reaffirm that. How do you, when someone's so passionate about one subject, I mean, everyone here that has social media, if you post something on social media and it's not liked, you're waiting for the specific person or people to comment. And if you post on like a CNN or Fox News or MSNBC, you get people from across the nation that are going to give you their opinion. So how do you go from one side of the room that is pro-gun, that believes it for safety of their home, safety of their person, safety of their family, to others who think that only the military should have it, or law enforcement? And I've had arguments with people that say even law enforcement shouldn't be armed. Well, then who's going to protect you? Who's going to protect you locally? And it doesn't make sense sometimes. And you know, I'm going to get back and forth in the argument, but how do you put that together? If you put them in the same room right now, if you have a side of, I use this analogy all the time, you have a side of criminals and a side of police officers that are armed. Oh, you know, am I going to put my weapon in the middle of the room and let's have a conversation? Like, how do you do that? How do you give up your right to give it at all, to give it to somebody else or that doesn't even want it? It's a tough call.
My sense is that the guns are certainly a factor, but they're not the only factor, and that the human factor is actually more important, actually. And so I guess I think most people would agree that there should be better screening to keep guns out of the hands of people who are mentally deranged, right? Or keep guns out of the hands of children, keep guns out of the hands of criminals. I guess I think we could do a much better job in that, you know, sort of paying attention to the human factor more carefully, I guess. And I'm not saying that guns are a factor, there's no question about it, and I think gun regulation has its place, but I think there's a way of transcending that argument, I think, by focusing on the human element. You know.
And I'll just piggyback on what Dwight said. I think guns are sort of the weapon of choice for today. And, you know, like say hypothetically we, you know, remove all the guns. There's just going to be a new weapon of choice, because the issue is the weight of what Todd was talking about, of the things that this individual has experienced, and it keeps growing and growing, and they can just no longer hold that weight, and that they feel like they need to do something.
Lisa, this question is directed at you, and it's, as a parent of a Virginia Tech freshman in 2007, I was somewhat impressed with the post-tragedy communication to students and their families. Although it took several days for this to begin, what is your perspective on this now?
Yeah, I think Virginia Tech's done a lot of things well, particularly infrastructure. They redid all the buildings that they were now locked. They redid their access control. They built an amazing threat assessment team that did really good work. It was, you know, now is the role model for threat assessment when it comes to universities. But I think they did some things not so well, and so in my opinion, one of those was the outreach to the physically uninjured survivors. But I guess going back to that question and communication, there was a lot of things in community. You know, the semester ended that day. We had the option to take our grades as is or finish out our classes. I just took all my grades as is and then returned for the fall. So they gave us that time to process and heal. But when I was in college, I didn't really understand what process in healing was. So along with that time, I needed some direction in terms of self-care and taking care of myself and the things that, okay, you went through something very traumatic. These are some of the things you might see. Be aware. When you go back into the classroom, you might have anxiety. I wasn't even, thinking about that till I found myself in the situation where I'm in the classroom having anxiety. So yeah.
Thank you. Todd, this question is from an educator in the audience, and the question is, I want to help students feel safe and feel trust toward those of us in charge, or I want to help students feel safe and feel trust toward those of us in charge of the school. What's your advice on how to do that?
Twofold. Absolutely, the trust has to be a factor. In the event of a critical incident, they're going to be looking for your leadership. And oftentimes I will hear from educators, when we do our lockdown drills, the students aren't taking it serious. My response to that is, don't worry about it. Follow through with the drill, and here's the reason why. If there's a real incident unfolding, like you know your students know you, and they'll see the change in your demeanor. Trust me, they will understand, and based on your response as a leader, they will fall right in line. So that's going to take time to build that trust. That's not something that's done overnight. It's part of that rapport building. And also, don't shy away from these conversations. If there's a way to build in some type of dialogue during the course of the semester, I greatly encourage that to help build that sense of trust and that rapport.
Thank you.
Can I add to that?
Sure.
When you talk about emergency preparedness, so often when schools do drills, the teachers all knew about the drill like half an hour in advance. The students are already lined up at the door with their books away, and everyone's just ready to go out to the parking lot. But in the event of a real emergency, there is no notification that it's coming. So when we do drills, we need to practice them like they're real, because that's when we'll see where the holes are in our plans. Because going through the motions is good for certain aspects, but we can do better. Because I like to compare it to like a pop quiz in school when the teacher says pencils out and books away. Like the best you got in the event of emergency is what you got up here. You don't have time to go find those safety plans and read through them, because by the time you do, the event's going to be over.
If I can add something, we do a lot of the trainings as well, and I always hear, I could never do this, or I can't do this. I physically can't do this. And I always relate it as what I said before. How about if you get attacked at home? How about if you were somebody, for a female teacher actually, that said, I can never do any of this. Well, how about if I came up to you in the parking lot and tried to grab your purse? She says, well, I'd fight you off. I said, then that's no different than here. You have to get your senses together. I said, and some of your colleagues might not be able to perform, and you have to at least try your best to do your best to get out of there. I mean, it's on you. No one, and again, we did it in schools, and the kids are laughing and think it's a joke. And I talked to each class, and I said, it's not a joke. You might think it's a joke now, but it's not a joke when it really happens, because you will not know how you're going to perform. So take it seriously. Put in your head, it's just like driving a car. You know how to drive your car. Sometimes you mess up, and you try to correct it, but eventually you still get behind that wheel. And that's what you need to do, is you need to take the wheel and continue, because the only people are going to count on you is if I show up to a scene, people are going to count on me to take charge. And if I don't know what I'm doing, then what? So you're there to protect people, but at the same time, people, just because you think you can't do it doesn't mean you won't be able to do it.
Just to piggyback, I've gotten calls from businesses and organizations about help us write a policy, help us put together a work prevention violence program. And my response is, well, we can put together something to satisfy the lawyers, but who's going to practice? Who's going to drill these policies and procedures? To Lisa's point, how do you know your policies and procedures work if you don't test them? So it's a holistic approach. It's just not an easy fix by reducing thoughts from your head, from the internet and research, and putting into the four corners of a document. It's a full, holistic, robust response in order to do it the right way.
Okay, thank you. So as we prepare to close out here, I just wanted to have a moment for everyone to provide a closing comment as we we've come together to talk about what comes after thoughts and prayers. We've had a conversation. And in your view, based on your background, what should be the next step?
Well, also, I'm not in a high enough position to really make decisions for my department, but if an incident did occur, and those of you in the audience that know people that were in the incident, it's support. It's reach out to them, check on them, because they're fighting a different fight in their own minds. So a lot of, again, as Lisa showed in one of the pictures, the media was right there, because that's a story at the moment. But what happens behind the scenes? What happens when those people go home? Whether you're a victim that had an injury or a victim mentally. Like, you don't know what happens when I leave. You don't know what happens when I go home. After my incident, I was in a bubble that couldn't be popped. People tried. And eventually I was able to get out of it, but it was, you need to support these people. You need to check in on them. Whether it's a family or a friend, or whatever the case might be, if you know that person, reach out to them. Hey, do you need anything? I know for me, when people are saying, hey, do you need anything, I was getting aggravated. Like, no, I'm all set. But it was just the point that people were still checking in. And I think that's the biggest support you can have, is support from your peers and your friends and your family.
Yeah, I'd agree with support. I wrote an article, and it focused on what to say and not to say to survivors or someone who had just been traumatized. Because when I look back at that first year afterwards, people were saying things to me that they came from such a good place and they were positive, but they were actually having the opposite effect. So just an example of one of those things is someone would tell me, I'm so strong, or you were so poised in that interview. And these positive comments weren't resonated with me, because inside my head, I was scared, I was lonely, I felt like, why did I live and these other people didn't? So it was this disconnect between sort of the negative uncomfortableness in my head and the positive things that they were saying. But like Josh said, checking in, especially around anniversaries, can be helpful. And, just giving them that space, because something I had to learn in my recovery was about boundaries. Because I would have strangers at the grocery store, when I had on a Virginia Tech hat, ask me, oh, were you there? And here we are in the grocery store, and it's like, do I just start opening up to you about my trauma right here? It doesn't seem like it's the right place, but I kind of want to talk to you about it. And that's when I started to shut down and just not talk about it at all, because I didn't know how to have those healthy boundaries. So you kind of got to, the person who's been traumatized is trying to figure it out, just as you as a support person is trying to figure it out.
My sense of it is that, obviously we should take care of the survivors and never forget about what you all have gone through. But I suppose the other part of it is that we should be prepared. I mean, in other words, that this can and will unfortunately happen again, and therefore we have to factor that into the way that we live, I think, unfortunately. But I think we do have to think about what the escape route is, or whatever, how we protect people, in these fraught situations, because it's real. And unfortunately, this seems to be a frequently recurring phenomenon in our culture. So, and as far as I know, they didn't have such events at the time that the Second Amendment was written. I mean, maybe there were such events, but they weren't publicized.
I see training as a low-hanging fruit. We find ways to go to training seminars or leadership training, grant writing, you name it. We find a way to make those sessions available to us. So I think having a better mindset in acceptance of training. There's only been one Parkland shooting. There's only been one Virginia Tech shooting. There's only been one Sandy Hook shooting. And the mindset of, well, it'll never happen here. I'd rather be prepared for something that may never come in my life than to not have a plan. I think another essential part is a better and robust response between private and public sector partnerships. Law enforcement, we're only a piece. We're only a piece of the solution. And I think there are mental health professionals that I would love to sit around the table with and be able to draw from their experience and their professionalism, and also include them as a task force, include them in street intervention, that if there is someone that's in the community that's known to the police department, that there are mental health professionals that could ride along and be that professional resource available to get the person the correct response, resources, health resources for them to help them work through their issues.
Thank you. I would also take this moment to remind our community, the campus community, of the CALM team, the crisis and life management team that we have here on campus to help those who find themselves in a distressful situation, or if you know of people in a distressful situation. As you leave here in the back in the lobby, there is a wall board. If you'd care to share some of your thoughts, you're welcome to do so. We would encourage it. But I am eternally grateful to our panelists here coming out to share in the conversation, to help shape the direction that we proceed with beyond thoughts and prayers. Thank you all for being here.